Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode, we're going to pick up where we left off with the nutrition website design and start the structure step of the process. So with this step, we're going to get into our code editor now and start on the HTML side of things. So the starter files for this project will be hosted on GitHub, and the link will be in the description. You can always go to github.com/build-ux to view the latest projects. This one's called Nutrition UI, and you can grab the starter assets by either cloning or downloading the repository straight to your computer and open it up in the code editor of your choice. So I have mine open in Visual Studio Code here, and a handy extension for this project will be the live server extension. And this is going to help us open our HTML document directly, and it'll do a lot of live refreshing and a lot of other nice convenient things for us as we build out our HTML and CSS for this project. Next up, my theme, if you're wondering, is from Rainglow. There's an extension for that on the VS Code marketplace, and I'm using the Frantic theme. All right, so I got my starter files downloaded, and all I've done is copy them into a working folder that we'll use for this episode, but feel free to place them wherever you want on your computer. From here, I think the first thing that we're going to do is just create our HTML document. So we're just going to call it index.html. So if you have Visual Studio Code or the Emmet extension, you can simply type exclamation point and hit tab, and it'll give us this nice snippet to start our HTML file. We're just going to call this Nutrition UI for now. If we were working on a final web page, of course, we'd want to have final SEO content for the title, meta description, and all those other good details. So let's just make sure that this is working as expected. And if we hit this Go Live button with the live server extension, we should see a preview of our web page pop up for us. All right, cool. So it looks like everything's wired up correctly. Now, the next step that we're going to do is actually just write HTML at this stage. We're not going to worry about styling in terms of our design at all. We're just going to focus on the semantic structure of the design we're trying to build out. And by waiting to tackle the styling later down the road, what this guarantees for us is we have a really clean content hierarchy. Everything is going to make sense if CSS didn't load at all. And most importantly, the website is going to be accessible to all users because we're starting with a really great structure to build from. So one of the files I provided in the starter assets is this content markdown file. And this just has all of the written content that we find in our design. That way you don't have to manually type it out or run into any typos. This should match exactly what we found in the design. So we're going to copy that over. We're just going to paste it directly into our HTML document here. And let me just indent it real quick. And if we give this a save, we'll notice that our live server has automatically loaded it up. Obviously, this isn't quite what we want, but we're going to start adding some HTML markup to wrap each of these text elements, get everything in a nice content hierarchy, and we should see it shaping up pretty well even without styles. All right, starting things off, we know that we have kind of three main content areas in our design. We have a global header with some navigation. We have the article body itself, and this sidebar element. So from a high level, we're just going to have a nav. Actually, that'll be inside of a header because there are other things besides just our nav and our header. Let's see, we also have our article, and then we lastly have an aside, which will be our sidebar. So with our header, let's bring up this nutrition. This will be a link, actually. Typically, a common pattern that you see is that you link to the homepage with the brand logo or icon, wherever you have. In our case, it's just live text to match the design, so we don't need an image or anything there. Next up, we have our navigation, and navigations can contain unordered lists, but in our case, just for simplicity, we can actually just do a series of anchor tags. So let's just do, let's see here, 4 anchor tags. That looks good. Let's just assume that each of these go to their respective areas. Got low carb, not card. or carve. Nutrition. And then what we can do with these is bring them up as well. One thing that's really cool with VS Code is multi-cursor selection. So here I'm just holding Alt to grab all of these, and then that'll allow me to cut them, move up into my links, and paste them right in. Cool, that's looking good. While we're at it, let's actually fix some of the indentation for our brand link here. Cool, let's kill some of this unnecessary indentation, or I should say spacing here. And lastly, in our global header, we'll have the menu button. Now, typically this would have a lot of other content associated with it for the actual menu. We're gonna hold off on building that out just yet, but for now, we at least want to make sure that our menu button looks as expected. So as I mentioned, this would be an actual button because it causes an action on the page and is not a link somewhere. That's a common accessibility and semantics issue you see, is people using either A tags or button tags to get closer to a visual style instead of focusing on what their semantic purpose is. So in this case, because it doesn't go anywhere else on the website, it just is for being an interactive element to create an action, we're gonna use button. So that's always an important thing to keep in mind. Next up, let's move into our article. And looking at this website, it actually brings up an important point. We have 20 types of berries and their health benefits. So this seems like a fitting heading for the entire page. However, a lot of times you'll see in visual designs that there are some headings that are pretty specific to the content, but may not explain the page as a whole very well. And in that case, that's where we would want to make sure we have some hidden text with an H1 tag. So that way for screen readers and SEO, they really understand what the main point of this page is. Here, because this page is really focused on this article, this can actually be our H1, I think, just fine. So let's move that into our H1. It's looking good. Next up, we have blackberries. And blackberries seems to be the section of this article. As I mentioned before, if we look at the design, we seem to be able to click on this section selector of sorts to move through each of the types of berries that this article is going to talk about. So in this case, because it's a particular section, let's move down the header hierarchy one level deeper. With an H2, we'll get our blackberries in there. Need to clean up some formatting here just so everything looks nice and tidy. Cool, now we have our blackberries heading. Next up, we have the actual content within the article. So this should just be a couple paragraph tags, nothing too crazy. Move those up. It's looking good. And we'll have 2 more of those, so I'll just pop those open real quick and copy them out. Cool, let's remove some of this unnecessary white space. We still have a couple other sections in the article, and then we'll move on to the side. So an important thing here is that we basically have all of the written content in the article. We also will have our images here, which we can stub out some elements for. We won't incorporate those just yet, but we might want to section off some of this later content in the article for the nutrition information and the sharing. So it probably makes sense at this point to introduce a new section to this markup. We could also wrap the content itself in a section. That's kind of personal preference. And at this stage, it's important to note that even though eventually we might need a couple extra elements for styling and layout purposes, at this stage, we're going to really refrain from introducing anything extra unless we absolutely need it. So within this section for nutrition, it looks like each of these is really just a list with, a label and some supporting details. So this probably seems like a great use case for an unordered list. And we're going to have 4 items, expand those out. And again, we can do our multi-cursor selection, clicking and holding Alt. We can select all that text, cut it out, move all of our cursors into the list items, paste it in. That saves a lot of time. Okay, cool. Last up, we will have the share section. So probably want one more section tag in here. Now within this section, the only visible text is the word share. And this probably seems like it's actually more of a heading for what this section is about. So looking at our content hierarchy, we have the article headline, the specific section we're in, and sharing and the nutrition actually are really specific to this section. So we're going to move one layer deeper in the heading hierarchy using H3. And then this actually is a good time to address the previous section, make sure this has an H3 as well. And we would want to call this, nutrition information. You might want to work with, a designer or a copywriter in this case to figure out specifically what each section should be called. Now it's important here, as you can see, I'm making typos. Any content you introduce really should be coming from source documents like we provided in the starter files for the design as a whole, but the same thing would be true of any hidden text. Obviously, we want to make sure everything's nice and clean. All right, so now that we have some hidden headings for nutrition and everything looks like it has the proper heading structure to it, let's continue on our share section here a little bit. So we have a Facebook link and a Twitter link. So obviously these are just two A tags. Now you can notice that these again, let me get my URLs in place. Facebook. These again really don't have any visual text, but it's going to be important to always provide either hidden text or visual text for any interactive element, any semantic element, I should say. In this case, they're links, so obviously we need to have some text within the links. And let me just get some placeholder links, URLs typed in here. Now, in the final design, we're not actually going to show Facebook or Twitter written out. We're going to, of course, use the icons. But again, we can't have empty links. And we need to let screen readers and search engines know where these links are headed and what's expected when you click on these links. So that's looking pretty good from an HTML perspective. Now, an important thing here is you'll notice that we did the article before the aside. So an important thing when starting to build out any project is to think about the underlying kind of ideal structure to the document and not worry too much about the visual presentation right out the gate. So in our design, of course, the sidebar comes first, but if you were reading this article, the primary content you'll want to interact with first is reading the article itself. You might skim through it, that's fine. And then after that, you might be thinking about what other related articles would be of interest. Additionally, after you've kind of engaged with this particular section of the article, that's probably when you would want to navigate to other sections of this article in this particular design case. But because the sidebar is really secondary to the article content, we're going to bring in the aside element after the article. All right, so this should be pretty straightforward. We're just going to have a couple links for each of these featured articles. Let's just make up a URL for some of these. 15 low sugar fruits. And then we'll bring in the link text there. Break this to a new line. 15 best low carb fruits. All right. So let's say this is 15 best low carb fruits. Call that good. Obviously, this would have actual URLs if this was a full website, but for now, we'll just put in some placeholders. All right, the last thing is kind of an interesting situation going on here. We have this section selector element. Now, there's a couple things here. We have this number, which is the current section we're on, so 3 of 20. And that might be important to add some hidden text to kind of give context around what this number represents. As a sighted user, you can kind of see it's visually tied to the article. And if you're able to click on it, you would immediately see the visual updates as well. But it's important to consider if there's any other information we might need to disclose for people who aren't seeing what's on the screen. In this case, just showing 3 and then having a couple buttons or icons after that isn't going to really explain what the point of this is. So we're going to have to get kind of creative here and think through what's the best way to present this information. I think this makes sense again to probably introduce a new section. I might actually wrap these featured articles in a section tag. And again, since they are kind of distinct sections, it probably makes sense to provide headings for both as well. Now, before, when we were within the article, we went down to an H3 for each of these kind of supporting sections because they were related to the Blackberries article. But in the case of this sidebar, these really these links really go outside of the context of this specific section of the article. So instead, we'll probably want to start with an H2. And let's call this either featured articles or related articles. Again, this would typically be coming from a designer or copywriter, but we'll just make it up for now. Next up, we have this other section in our sidebar where we're going to kind of have this selector UI for moving through the article. Let's think through what we'd like to call this particular UI piece. So in terms of the information we want to present here, it might be best to really say you are viewing section 3 of 20. This would probably be really helpful information to disclose, so that way people know where they're currently at and also how many items they can move through. This is kind of a pagination almost pattern. Now, this is probably just some paragraph text, so let's put it inside there. And we'll be able to style it as needed when the time comes, and also hide certain parts of this text, but we'll be using this 03 to show it. Next up, we will have a couple of buttons. And let's see, the first button would go to previous section. Go to the previous section. Want to make sure even our hidden text is still, kind of natural language, just like you would write anything that's visually shown as well. Go to the previous section, and let's say go to the next section. Lastly, another thing we might want to consider is, again, a heading to kind of designate what's going on here. So it'd probably be another H2, and let's say choose article section, something along those lines. We might refine some of this language for now, but we just want to make sure everything's accounted for, especially things that aren't visually shown in the design, but we need to ensure are going to exist in our HTML as we move along to the styling phase of things. Now's a good time to save our document. Should actually save a lot more frequently than I just did, but let's take a look at what we have in our preview. So as you can see, it's actually pretty usable. If CSS failed to load, or if somebody had a really bad internet connection, at the very least, if our server's just getting hammered, things like that, we would be able to serve up a pretty understandable and usable version of this article. All right, so it looks like we have a couple of things that we forgot to add in. We need to bring in our search input into the global header here, and also we need to bring in our images. So let's start off with the search input up there in the global header. So here you can see that all we really get is this button that you would click, and we have to assume that when you click that, it would reveal a search input and maybe a submit button as well. So let's just assume that there is no styling, but we know that that's the overall pattern we'd like to follow. So let's create another button. Let's say open search. And when we click this, we would open up a form. We won't worry about the action just yet. There's an input of type search. This is one of the newer types of inputs. It's a little more specific and semantic to the use case. For older browsers that wouldn't understand this, it will just revert back to a text input. We also need a label for this. So let's call this global search. And we'll have to have a corresponding ID that matches that. So that way these are associated with each other. And the label will say search nutrition website, something along those lines. Search the nutrition website. Sounds good. Okay, cool. Lastly, within the form, we will have a button of type submit, and this will allow us to actually submit the search with our form. And we'll want to just say that this is search. Nice and succinct. Okay, I think that's everything for this search form. We give this another save. Looks pretty good. So you could see that we would click this button to open the search, and we would reveal this form with some nice styling. We may or may not include the label depending on what our designer wants visually, but in this case, we might as well show it as long as we're going to reveal the whole form. At any rate, all of this search form will be hidden by default, as we're really just going to focus on achieving kind of pixel perfect replication of this design once we get to the styling stage. All right, let's also make sure we get our images into the content here. For now, it seems like both these images can probably just go at the very end of the content. So let's look in our assets folder, images, we have final. I also provided the source ones in case you wanted to crop them yourselves or work with them in other capacities, but we just need the final versions here. For now, we're only going to implement the regular 1x versions. And then once we get into the styling stage, we can talk about offering up multiple resolutions depending on screen size, depending on network speed, using source set attributes and other things along those lines. But for now, we're just coding up a very simple static mockup. So in VS Code, I'm going to go here and copy the relative path just to make sure it's nice and accurate to where we are in the file. And cleaning up anything here. Let's change these backslashes to forward slashes. Cool, that looks good. And lastly, with each image, we need to ensure that there's really descriptive alt text for both of them. So with alt text, it's important to leave out any redundant information. So we wouldn't want to say an image of, blueberries in a bowl. We don't need to say an image of, because screen readers, as they'll go through this content, they'll read off image and then immediately go into the alt text. So instead we could say blueberries in a bowl. That's fine. And no need for a period either. I don't know actually why there's blueberries as an image when blackberries is the current section, but oh well. Next up, we have our chia pudding image with blackberries. So this one's a little more relevant. Again, let's clean up this file path a little bit just to work for our purposes. And get those to /. All right. And make sure that this alt text is descriptive for this particular image. So let's see, we have chia pudding with blueberries and blackberries. Cool, that sounds good. Now, lastly, as I mentioned, we do have this menu button up here. We're going to start off by just styling it directly and assuming that when you click on it, it'll open up another menu. At this stage in the project, though, I think it's probably best to not get too worried about what the menu itself would look like, as we'll probably tackle that in another stage. And if we decide to include it in this project, I'll provide the markup for that as well. Okay, cool. So let's go back to our live preview. And here's our website. I think we're pretty much done. So obviously we need to do a lot in terms of styling to get it there. But what's really important to recognize, just again, I can't stress this enough, is that at its core, except for maybe the open search button and some of these that aren't wired up, we're presenting all of the content of this web page in a really accessible and understandable format. So by default, we have nice visual hierarchy of our elements. Everything has a really intuitive sequence to it. And everything is interactive and uses the correct element for its purpose. So all these links should work. And if we were to wire up these buttons, those should have perfect function as well, regardless of styling being present. So really the only HTML elements we don't have into our project already at this stage are for the SVG icons, which we'll bring in once we get into styling things, as well as hopefully not too many additional elements that we might introduce for layout or styling purposes. As I mentioned, the real advantage of starting out with just raw HTML is to make sure there's no clutter in the markup and to really guarantee that nice clean structure from the start. So one more quick thing before we finish up here is I just realized that although we have nice clean structure with our article and the side, we actually need to wrap these in a main element. And that'll really help screen readers hop right into the core content of the page. And that should do it. So that should make a lot more sense in terms of having everything nicely divided between header, main, and then if we had a footer, which we don't in this current design, we would have footer following header and main. Give that a save, make sure it looks good. Shouldn't see any visual change over here, just a nice semantic bonus there. And I think that should do it for this episode. So in the next episode, we'll get into styling with CSS and have a ton of fun getting this design to look as originally intended, make sure everything's pixel perfect, and looks great, as well as functions really well.